let's go ahead and start.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the in-person and virtual presentation of the Cuban economy in 2020-22, Back to the 1990s Crisis by Dr. Carmelo Mesalago. My name is Jorge Duani, and I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, which organized today's event. I'm also happy to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. Before we proceed, let me describe briefly the format for our event. First, we will hear our guest speaker, Dr. Mesalago, who will speak for about 15 minutes. And then we'll open it up for a question and answer period for approximately 15 minutes with both our in-person audience as well as our virtual audience, if we can manage the technology. Those of you who are seeing us on Zoom can submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will look at them and then post them to our speaker. I'm really honored to briefly introduce Dr. Carmelo Mesalago, who is a Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Economics and Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He has been a visiting professor, researcher, and lecturer in 40 countries. He was a founder and editor for 18 years of the flagship journal Cuban Studies, and he is the author of 95 books and pamphlets, as well as 318 articles and chapters. This is very Carmelo. He counts every specific, anything that can be counted, he counts them. Published in 9 languages in 35 countries, about half of them on Cuba's economy and social welfare. Among his recent publications, and I'm not going to list all of them, of course, but the most recent one is a book manuscript that he has finished and submitted for publication, titled Comparative Socialist Models and Performance, Cuban Planned Economy and Sino-Vietnamese Socialist Market. Trump, Breve Historia de una Presidencia Singular, which is co-authored and just recently presented at Books and Books this year. An evaluation of 4 decades of pension privatization in Latin America, 1980 to 2020, Promises and Reality, published in 2021. The Cuban Economy, the Current Crisis, Its Causes and Policies for the Future. It was a briefing published by the Cuban Research Institute in 2020. And a couple of other recent titles include El impacto en la economía cubana de la crisis en Venezuela y las políticas de Trump, co-authored with Pavel Vidal in 2019, and a book that we also presented at Books and Books, The Voices of Change in Cuba from the Non-State Sector, published in 2018, which is also an updated and translated version of a book published earlier in Spanish. He was selected among the 50 most influential Ibero-American intellectuals in 2014 and nominated to the SSRC Albert O. Hirschman Prize in Social Sciences in 2020. And also, we're very proud that he's a founding member of the Community Advisory Board of FIU's Cuban Research Institute. On a personal note, I typically say that I want to be like Carmelo when I grow up, but because I'm also getting old, I would rather say that Carmelo has served as the intellectual inspiration for several generations of Cuban scholars, including my own. His intellectual productivity, his honesty, his fairness are legendary, and we really look up to Carmelo and hope that he continues to be very productive in the future. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Carmelo Mesalago.
Thank you very much, Jorge. A long relationship since the beginning with CRI and FIU, so I am very happy and honored to be here. So I worked more than 1 month in this. There is a paper actually outside, so you can get it. And what I am going to do is essentially based on Cuban data, on Cuban statistics, make an analysis of the economic crisis or the current economic crisis using a series of indicators. Okay, so this crisis started around 2019 and worsened in 2020, 2022. And in the data that I am going to present, you will be seeing that it's approaching, if we have not reached already, the, the magnitude of the severe crisis of the 1990s. There are several indicators that are even worse than they were in the so-called special period in time of peace. And this crisis is usually simplistically explained based on two factors, and this is kind of from both extremes, either the communist system or the embargo, which is called blockade in Cuba. And I think this the reality is much more complex, as you are going to see. There are a series of factors concatenated which explain this phenomenon. And the first one, in my opinion, is the inefficiency of the economic system. Cuba have a predominant central plan model with reforms, but these reforms have been very modest, with a lot of obstacles, zigzags in policy, and even a reversal since 2016. And of course, the role of the market is totally subordinated to the plan. And there is also a predominance of a state ownership of means of production over private ownership. This is, in large measure, the Soviet model that have failed all over the world. I am not talking here about market socialism. That's another animal, which I will discuss later. And these reforms undertaken mostly under Raúl Castro presidency and then Díaz-Canel have been completely insufficient to return the economy to an economic path. It have been, as you are going to see, it have been a very bad results in economics and also in social terms. There is another paper that I published in El Toque, and it's going to be published also by CRI, that deals with the social impact of the crisis. The second factor is the very serious humanitarian, economic, and social crisis of Venezuela, the major benefactor of the Cuban economy, and that have reduced economic aid and oil supply from Venezuela, and particularly buying of professional services from Cuba. The third one, and this is pretty much related to the Venezuelan case, has been the inability of the Cuban economy to finance its imports with its own exports. We are going to see that throughout the revolution, Cuba have had a deficit in the merchandise trade, except for 1 year. So out of 65 years, 64 Cuba have had a deficit in merchandise trade. And that have made Cuba dependent on one trade partner, oil supplier, and subsidiaries, in this case, Venezuela, before, of course, the USSR. And in the first place, the strong sanctions imposed by Trump that strengthened the embargo and have been mostly maintained by Biden. Fifth, the COVID-19 epidemic that have had devastating effects, particularly on tourism and remittances, as we are going to see. The late implementation and improper implementation of the so-called, in Cuba, it's called tarea ordenamiento, which is the monetary and exchange rate unification. It was very late and not properly implemented. I have created a series of problems, inflation particularly. And finally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that has propelled a world inflation reflected in Cuba and very high prices, particularly in food and oil. So these are the factors as I see them. And as I said before, this is, I would say, 95% based on Cuban statistics and official reports, and indicators that describe the dear economic situation, but also trace similarities with the crisis of the 1990s and provide prospects for 2023. The data, statistical data ends in 2021, and the reason is that this is the latest Oficina Nacional de Estadística Anuario Estadístico, which is now complete. You can have access to it in the internet. The Anuario for 2022 will start publishing probably in March, the less important data, and then the macroeconomic data and the external cycle data will not be published probably until October. So the data that I hear, it comes from official speeches and other reports of the Cuban government. So let's start with a series of indicators, and this will be first macroeconomic indicators. And the most important one, of course, is gross domestic product at constant prices. And you see here the figure and the significant decline starting in 2006 to 1.0 in 2014. Since 2016, there is basically economic stagnation. Here, there is a small decline of 0.2%, and here is almost 11%. This is the highest drop in GDP since the year 1993, in which the economy contracted 14.9%. That was the worst year of the crisis of the 1990s. And according to the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, this decline in Cuba is the worst after Venezuela, which was minus 30%, and it was also higher than the regional average for Latin America of almost 7%. The official goal for 2021 was 6%, and as you can see, it was 1.3%, less than one half. And the target for the year 2022 was 4%, and it's reported by the Cuban government as 2%. I reserve my judgment about the reliability of this figure because until I do an analysis of the Anuario that will be in the fall, it seems to me that in view of the scattered data that we have, I don't rely too much in that figure. But you have to take into account that when you have such a big decline in GDP, 1.3 is nothing. But after 1.3, 2%, in view of the information available, this is more questionable. And the annual average from 2019 to 2022 was minus 2%, which is the worst in Latin America. Okay, now, second, we have gross capital formation. This is an important indicator because as bigger gross capital formation as a percentage of GDP is, more the possibilities of rapid economic growth in the future. And Cuba in 1989, that was before the crisis of the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe communism, reached 25%. That was a pretty good figure. But it had declined by 2021 to 16%. The official target in Cuba is 25%, but have not been met after 1989. And the fiscal deficit, also as a percentage of GDP, in 2020 was almost 18%, and that was the worst again since the 1990 crisis. So as you can see, I am comparing with the so-called special period type of peace. Inflation is phenomenal in Cuba. According to the Anuario, the so-called official deflator of GDP was 401% in 2021. Luis and Luis have calculated anywhere between 270 and 470%. there are two different things. The first is dealing with the economy as a whole. The second is consumer, the type of inflation, and the economic intelligence report, 740%. This is among the highest, if not the highest, inflation rates in the world, and it's higher than it was during the crisis of the 1990s. Monetary liquidity is excess money in circulation in the hands of the population. It's also called M2. And it is a sort of surrogate indicator for inflation. I trust this actually more than inflation because in Cuba, the basket of goods and services to measure inflation have never been published. And we know also that any transaction which is not in national pesos is not taken into account in the calculation of the consumer price index. And that was 120% of GDP. The money circulation was more than the value of GDP. And this is the highest again since the 1990s. And finally, the exchange rate. As you know, Cuba had two different monies in circulation, the CUC, the so-called convertible peso, which was not convertible because it was not transacted in the national markets. And the rate was 24 CUP for $1. But in the black market, CUP is now the only money in circulation in addition to hard currencies like the dollar, the euro, etc. But in the black market, it was 120. As you can see, 5 times the official rate. And then what Cuba did was since the beginning, most economists agree that the exchange rate of 24 to 1 was significantly undervalued. It should have been much more than 24. And then Cuba rose the exchange to 110. And I checked a talk yesterday, which every day has what they call the informal market. It's actually a black market. So it's 163 in terms of dollars yesterday versus 110 official rate. Okay, so now let's go to a series of indicators on physical production. And I start with one of the most important ones, which is the industrial output index. This is based on the year 1989 as 100. So everything is related to 1989. For instance, if you look at the year 1992, 52%, that means that there was a decline here of 68% in this period. And as you can see, there was some partial recovery here that ends in the year 2018, and then it drops again. And in 2021, which is the latest year that we have, was 54.8%. So that means that there was a decline of 42 percentage points since 1989. Okay, now I am going to go into specific sectors of the economy. First, manufacture. Output comparing 1989 with 21 in the sugar industry declined by 90%, textiles by 96%, fertilizers by 98%. When we compare 2016 and 2020, cigars declined by 22% and cement by 55%. I have selected the most important product for Cuba to measure performance in most economies in the world. Mining. Oil production, there was a significant increase of oil production when you compare the pre-revolutionary Cuba because there was a very little exploitation. And it increased until 2010, and then it declined. And by 2020, it was minus 23%. And even worse was natural gas that declined almost by half between 2015 and 2021. And this increased the dependency on imported energies. As you know, there was a huge fire in Matanzas in 2022. There was a loss of 75,000 cubic meters of gas, and the government estimates the total loss in about $10 billion. Electricity between 2016 and 21, a decline of more than 60%. And out of capacity of 6,558 megawatts in 2021, only 37% was operational. Piñon, who is here, have the most important research in the field of energy in Cuba. He identifies 20 obsolete plants. The most modern plant, which is in Cienfuegos, is working at half capacity. And all these have resulted in a return of the blackouts anywhere between 7 and 18 hours daily, which are close to the peak in the 1990s. The performance in agriculture and livestock is dismal. Look at this indicator. Oops. The annual rate as a percentage of GDP in 2016-21, annual rate minus 7.7% in agriculture. That explains, of course, the scarcity of food in Cuba. And in the period between 2016 and 2021, virtually all agricultural products declined. Citrus by 69%, beans by 58%, rice by 55%, pigs by 49%. You cannot find pork meat in the markets in Cuba. A decline of 41% in corn, 39% in cow milk, 32% in tubers, which are an important part of the Cuban diet, 29% of leaf tobacco, 25% vegetable, 23% fish and seafood. And this one, a very important indicator, out of 13 key agricultural products, 8 of them were below the 1989 level in 2021. The sugar harvest, the latest one for which we have data, which is the last one, 21-22, was 174,000 metric tons. That was half of the target. Recall that Cuba in the 1980s was producing 8 million tons of sugar, and even sometimes more than 8. And this last harvest was the lowest in history. Out of that figure, 600,000 have to go to the domestic consumption, and 400,000 have to be exported to China. And of course, there was half of it. So you have to import sugar from Brazil. The data that we have so far of the current harvest, which began last year, is that it's going to be worse than the previous sugar harvest. And then an important point, manufacturing and agricultural production fell in virtually all products since 2016. So this happened before Trump began to introduce the tough measures against Cuba, which was 2018, 2019. And we will see several things that show that the impact of the system, as I ranked before, in my opinion, is worse than the Trump sanctions. So now let's go to the external sector. This indicator, for me, is one of the most revealing of the deterioration of the Cuban economy, but the incapacity of the Cuban economy, as I said at the beginning, to produce enough to export and so pay for imports. When you compare the year 1989 with the year 2021, the value of good merchandise exports declined by 67%. The value of imports, on the other hand, increased by 5%. So the deficit in the balance of goods or merchandise increased by 218%. As I said before, you have a deficit throughout the revolution except for 1 year. Now, I have to make a distinction between goods and services. And I have been referring to the balance of goods. In spite of this systematic deficit in the balance of goods, Cuba did very well in terms of the exportation of services, particularly professional services. The second is tourism. And the balance of export versus imports of services resulted in a surplus which exceeded the deficit in the balance of goods or merchandise. So that was very good for Cuba because you have a surplus. What happened is that after a peak around 2013, that surplus steadily declines, and then for the first time in the 21st century, in the year 2021, Cuba have a total deficit. That means the services surplus was incapable of covering the deficit in goods of $54 million. And the professional exports, which is the first hard currency revenue of Cuba, that's mostly physicians, in the period 2018-2021, declined by almost 1/2. The trade partners of Cuba in 2021 rank were first China, then Venezuela, then Spain, then Canada, and finally Russia. In 2020, there was a fall in trade volume with all major partners. When you compare the year 2021 with 2013, there was a decline in the trade volume of 34% with Venezuela, 25% with Spain, and 17% with China, but there was a small surplus in favor of Canada, 15%, 14% with Russia. In the last two, this was below the previous peaks. This trade with these major partners has systematically resulted in a huge deficit against Cuba. And measured in US million dollars, in the case of Venezuela, 1,142, so that's $1.1 billion, 841 with Spain, 628 with Russia, and 554 with China. By the way, something important about China is that trade with China was like twice what the trade was in 2021, but it resulted in a deficit against Cuba of $1 billion. Why? Because China was exporting a lot of things to Cuba, but Cuba was exporting very little to China. So the Chinese, what they did, they reduced export to Cuba, and that resulted also in a reduction in the deficit. Total hard currency revenue, when we compare the first half of 2022 with the first half of 2018, it went down 38%. When you combine all hard currency revenue that Cuba has. And oil supply in the first semester of 2022, Venezuela was sending Cuba 56,610 daily barrels. That was half the peak of 115,000 in 2015. Okay. Remittances. This is the second hard currency revenue in Cuba. And as you can see, there is a steady increase in remittances. This is in million US dollars. The peak is in 2019, it's 3.7 billion. And then it declined sharply to 1,084 million. So it's a decline of almost 71%. Now, this is very interesting because the peak take place in 2019, and then this decline is mostly due to COVID-19. This is a major reason. The peak actually takes place under the Trump administration and the sanctions that I have referred to before. And here you have halted flights also. You have the suspension for the Western Union to send wires to Cuba, to Gaesa, etc. And this is tourism, and tourism is the third source of hard currency in Cuba. As you can see, there is a peak of 4.7 million tourists here. And then it goes down steadily, and it declines mostly in 2020 because of the COVID. And then there is a recovery in the year 2022, about 1.6 million tourists. I must say that the goal or the target for the year 2022 was 2.5 million tourists, and they only made 1.6 million. And the second, the red line, this is gross income from tourism, and it's gross because it doesn't take into account the cost of imports for tourism. When you subtract all that is imported for the tourist sector, then we are talking about net. Cuba doesn't have a statistical series on that, but 1 or 2 years ago, the Ministry of Economics and Planning said that the value of those imports were 60%. So the real revenue, which is net, is considerably less than the ones that you can see there. And once again, you have an increase. You have a peak here in 2017, and then it goes down. And the latest figure that we have is 404. That is a decline of 87% in gross income. The decline in the number of tourists it was of 90%. And we don't have the figure for gross tourist income for 2022, so we have to wait until the data is published. Well, direct foreign investment is very important, but I must tell you that it's very difficult to measure because there is not a statistical series. This is surprising because Cuba is interested in foreign investment, but we don't have a statistical series on that. We only have occasional reports in the press and in the speeches of the leaders. But there are 3 different ways to measure this foreign investment. The first one are promises. Promises is simply that. The second one is a contract in which the country write a contract with the government. The third one, for me, the most important is realization of investment, when it becomes operational. And not always they make a decision between the 3, but you have here some information. For instance, in the period between 2014 and 22, there were 285 new businesses approved. 29 of them were reinvestment of previous businesses. But in 2021, only 47 new began, only 47, of which only 25 were actual operational. And they have begun. And then in the special zone of development of Mariel, in 9 years, out of 62 businesses approved, only 32 were in operation, were realized. And the general figure for total investment in Cuba is that only 13% of projected investment have been realized. So this is an important figure. You may see 2.5 billion, but the average is about $500 million per year in the entire period. External debt. Cuba only publishes the so-called negotiated debt. The debt that has not been negotiated is not published in the statistical yearbook. And out of that, 81% was forgiven, was condoned, which was a major victory of the Cuban government. And we are talking about $9.3 billion condoned. And pending, it was about 19%. That is not accounted in the statistics. And Cuba did not pay the restructured debt with the Paris Club in October 2019, requested a postponement of the payments and interest in 2020 and 21 and only got for the first 2020, and also didn't pay the restructured debt with Russia and China. They postponed the debt, but with interest. I have estimated the outstanding debt in 2020 $20.7 billion. International reserve, no data have been ever published. In my opinion, it should be a very low level or virtually exhausted due to the crisis. And finally, Cuba doesn't have an international lending of last resort because it doesn't belong to the IMF, the World Bank, or the Inter-American Development Bank. Now, what have been the reaction in Cuba from the population to this terrible crisis that Cuba is going through? We have three things. We have public demonstrations, we have mass exodus, and electoral abstention. The protests, the first one that we have in Cuba was in 1994, the so-called Maleconazo, when it was the boat raft, the boat exodus. And then in November 27, there was a protest from intellectuals and artists against laws that restricted the freedom of expression in art, literature, etc. For a brief moment, it appeared that there was going to be a dialogue with the intellectuals and the Cuban government. Unfortunately, that didn't come through. That was the base for the movement Patria y Vida. Then in July 11, 2021, there was only one day, but it was protests all over the country. And very interestingly, the cell phones play a very important role in the extension of the protests throughout the country because they were communicating with different provinces and municipalities. And so it was all over the country. More than 50 cities and towns. And finally, on October 2022, you have less number of people protesting, but for several days. And the government strongly repressed this. There were 1,000 people in prison reported with very high sentences, sometimes 30 years. The mass exodus is never something like this. It's 250,000, which is more than all the previous exodus combined in 1 year. And finally, electoral abstention, we can see is documented in the paper, an increasing percentage of those that abstain or vote against in successive referenda and elections. Now, finally, I got to the economic outlook. And there are more adverse factors than positive factors. The first one, you have seen the continuous deterioration in the Cuban economy. It's not a matter of 1 year. I mean, it's a steady deterioration, particularly in sectors such as agriculture, manufacture, energy, etc. But that deterioration also happens in social indicators. As I told you, there is another paper publishing El Toque a couple of weeks ago, and it's going to be translated into English and put online by CRI. And the social deterioration is parallel to the economic deterioration. So even if the goal of GDP growth for this year is 3%, quite frankly, I doubt that this can happen, particularly if you have an increase of 1.3, then 2%, then 3%, very difficult in view of all the data that we have seen. But even if this goal is met, the economy will be 8 percentage points on the 2019 level. This is an estimate from Alejandro Gil, the Minister of Economics and Planning. The second major problem is that exportation of physicians is facing a barrier. Well, first you have the denunciation against the PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, because trafficking is serving as intermediary to sell professional services to Brazil. The new president in Brazil, Lula, have made very clear that he won't contract new Cuban physicians. He will be using those physicians that are already in Brazil. The president of Chile have said that he won't hire physicians. Colombia is facing the guerrilla. Peru, the government was favorable to Cuba, was tried to orchestrate a self-coup and is out, and there is a phenomenal instability in that country. Mexico could, but there is a significant opposition from the medical union and many economic and political problems in Mexico. So there is not going to be a big rebound in terms of revenue for professional services. The monetary unification, everybody agreed that it was too late and at the worst moment. And it should have been preceded, as in China, Vietnam, and other countries, by significant economic reforms, which didn't happen. So the results were terrible. You saw the very high inflation and food prices and the phenomenon of scarcity due to the decline of both domestic production and imports of food. Cuba was imported about $2 billion in food, and it's imported much less than that. So the two combined are the explanation for the severe scarcity of food in Cuba. China have done donations. Cuba have a long list of the donations that Cuba have done. They didn't publish a figure, and in my opinion, when they didn't publish a figure, that means to me that the figure is not very important, because otherwise Cuba have shown that as a victory. And there are a couple of areas in which these donations are important, but the others are marginal things. Of course, for Cuba, it would have been much more important, not that the China makes one-time donation, but it makes investment in Cuba and increases trade. For instance, China suspended the supply of raw materials for the pharmaceutical industry in Cuba because Cuba was not paying the importation of those inputs, and so that had a bad impact in the production of pharmaceutical products that were increasing. And then suddenly they don't publish more figures in the last 3 years. For me, when they don't publish those figures, that means that it has been a decline. Russia has risen, as you saw, to the 5th trade partner, but 99% of the trade is a deficit against Cuba, meaning that Cuba is sending Russia very little exports, and Russia is sending oil, food, and a lot of things. Then comes a war in Ukraine, and the Russian economy is projected by the IMF and the World Bank to decrease in 2023. So my conclusion is that Russia could provide occasional supply of oil and food to Cuba, but it can, no way that it can replace under the conditions that the country is a replacement for Venezuela. And then there have been a steady decline in foreign trade and investment from Europe, which is aggravated by the repression of protests. by the government and the support of Cuba to Putin in the war in Ukraine. Finally, there are U.S. conversations on migration, possibly more flight that could be interpreted as a positive rather than negative, except that there are very powerful Democrats in Congress that strongly oppose a new rapprochement with Cuba. And the positive factors. First of all, the temporary relaxation of U.S. measures on Venezuela. As you know, the United States is trying to get oil from Venezuela, trying to do a deal with Exxon. And if that comes through, but it depends in large measure to the behavior of Venezuela, of the Maduro government, there may be some improvement in Venezuelan economy. According to ECLA, in 2021 to 2022, there was an increase in economic growth in Venezuela, but of course it's coming down from a drought that is worse than Cuba's. So there may be some improvement, and if there is an improvement in Venezuela, that could help Cuba. There is a nickel agreement with Sherritt International, which is a major corporation extracting nickel in Cuba. In order for Cuba, with the profits from nickel, to pay the outstanding debt of $260 million to Sherritt. And then there is the authorization, the most expected for years, authorization of small and medium enterprises, but only so far 5,061 have been raised. That's a small number, taking into account that we are talking about hundreds of thousands of these enterprises. And Cuba heralded the approval of 75 measures in 2022 for the recovery. But if you take a look at those measures, they are very vague. It's like a menu. This is what I would like to have, but there are no concrete plans in terms of implementation. So we have seen this so many times in the past that it's like a repetition of the same picture that you have seen before. And finally, lifting restrictions to the importation of food, medicines, and other goods. And this was done by the Cuban government due to the desperate situation that they have with these goods to alleviate the scarcity. So I am finishing. I'm sorry, I think I took a couple of minutes more. So what to do? Many Cuban academic economists believe that instead of adopting a free market model, which is what most people would like to have for Cuba, the country could follow the Sino-Vietnamese model of market socialism or socialist market, adapting it, of course, to Cuban peculiarities. A model that has been rejected by the country's highest authority, particularly Fidel, Machado, Raúl. At the beginning was apparent to be favorable, but then when he became the president, he was much more cautious, and all is documented in the paper. And in a book that I concluded, and Jorge very kindly mentioned in his introduction last November, this book compares the Cuban model of central plant with the Sino-Vietnamese model of market socialism, and it's based in 100 statistical indicators and more than 300 bibliographical sources. Let me tell you, this has been the toughest book that I have written because, of course, I don't speak Chinese, I don't speak Vietnamese, and I was planning to go to the country. The two countries have grants for that, but the pandemic came and I couldn't go, so I have to organize teams of researchers in both countries. I send them questionnaires, they send me the answers in English, of course. I process the answer, and this is the base for the most important materials of the book. So what I found is that China and Vietnam far surpassed Cuba in their economic performance. But that we know. This is nothing new. What is surprising even to me is that I have done the same thing in terms of social indicators. And recall that Cuba, at the time of the revolution, in terms of social indicators, I have written a lot about this, was in the first 2 or 3 places of Latin America. So it was well developed, socially speaking. On the other hand, China, Vietnam were very underdeveloped countries with very bad social indicators. So these two countries have been able, I have 10 social indicators in the macro indicators in the book, and only 2, Cuba surpasses China and Vietnam. In the other 8, China and Vietnam are well ahead of Cuba. And in terms of social security, which is a major advancement in Cuba before and after the revolution, China have already surpassed Cuba. So that is the most surprising finding of the book. So for many years, I have recommended that Cuba follow this model or another hybrid model, democratic, such as the welfare state in Scandinavian countries. My new book ratifies my previous recommendations as an adequate way out of the current crisis and to place the country on the path of economic and social development for the good of its people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carmelo. Yeah, we'll get the lights on in a minute. So we have a couple of questions, actually 4 questions on the Zoom connection, but I'll turn it over to the in-person audience. We'll take a couple of questions here and then we'll proceed to the other ones. Yes. Can you focus on 1 or 2, Sergio, please?
Micrófono. Porque no te oigo.
I was curious why remittances peaked in 2019. Obviously, that was the tail end of the Trump administration, and the constraints were in place. So what's the answer? What explains that? And then the other one that no one ever raises to me, and is quite curious. My understanding is that in the tourism sector, the Cubans claim that most of the investment, you might agree with me on this, is internally generated. That the operators, the European or Canadians, are operators, but they do not actually invest a heck of a lot of money in that sector. So my question to you is, where does the money come from for the development of the tourism infrastructure? And if in fact it's mostly Cuban money, given the circumstances, how long would it take for those investments to be realized, to be recouped?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Sergio, as you know, Cuba doesn't publish any data on remittances. And the only statistical series that I have seen through many years is Emilio Morales. So I am using Emilio's series, and it's quoted in the paper. It's impossible for me to answer your question because I really don't know the answer for that. Now, I doubt that explanation from Cuba. I do think that Spaniards are heavily investing in tourism in the island. Despite that, 2 hotels, Spanish hotels, went shut down. There is much more that are under construction. And according to the statistical yearbook, the amount that is invested in tourism is huge. And there is a persistent criticism from Cuban academic economists, and you know that it doesn't make sense for Cuba to invest in tourism. It would be much better to invest in agriculture, for instance, to solve the food crisis. Furthermore, when you look at the statistical series on the occupational rate of hotel beds, it goes down from 67%, the last year is 2021, to 12.7. That's after the worst point in the pandemic, right? So it doesn't make any sense, except that, of course, this is controlled by Gaesa, and they are trying to make money out of this, not only tourism, but they have a lot of enterprises which are managed by the military. And I think that this is one of the major, there is a chapter in my new book in which I ask the question, why, in view of the success of the Sino-Vietnamese economic model, Cuba has not followed that model adapted to Cuban peculiarities, because also the Communist Party is in control. And I think the reason is mostly political, not economic. And one of the major barriers is Gaesa. Gaesa doesn't want to give up anything that they have. If there is a process of decentralization of decision-making and expansion of the private sector, Gaesa is going to suffer. And they are in control of the government, and therefore they will oppose it.
Thank you. Can we get a microphone, please?
Regarding the figures on remittances that you got from your source, can we conclude that that includes the money that travelers bring personally to Cuba, or is that only the ones that are transferred through mechanism like Western Union or banks? Or the reason I'm asking the question is because, as you know, of that 250,000 people who are arriving to the United States, crossing the border, or still some of them who had the old visas and decided to remain here, or the ones who are arriving to the Keys recently. Believe it or not, some of them come with a lot of dollars. And I have talked to some of them, and there are people in Cuba who have sold their houses, and they sell them in dollars. And I have heard from figures from $8,000. There was another case of $40,000 sale, and even a $100,000 sale. Then what is the source of those dollars that are circulating in Cuba? How Cuban citizens have those large figures in American dollars, and how they are using them to buy the properties from the ones who are coming through the different ways that they are coming recently.
Yeah, thank you, Rolando. Let me tell you that Emilio Morales have two different series of remittances. One is cash, another one is goods. Because remittances, a lot of people send food to Cuba, for instance, and clothing and whatever. So what I show is only the cash. Now, you have to ask Emilio, but I don't see how he can estimate what the mulas takes to Cuba, because this is secret. I mean, the people go there and give it to the person, or so there is no way that he can find out. It's not deposited in a bank, or it's going through a wire that can be detected. So I don't think that is included. So what it tells you is that probably if the figures are good, in reality, there should be more than it shows only in terms of cash, because you have another amount which is close to cash in goods.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions from the virtual audience, and two are related. They have to do with the figures and the sources. One by Antonio Garcia, and he wants to know how accurate these numbers are. And
Remittances also?
no, in general, the statistics that you cited. And Ala Ortuzar Young also refers to Cuban statistics on economic productivity and so on. And if you can talk about the reliability of these data and how you handle with the issue of whether they accurately reflect the picture.
Well, of course, I always get this question after my presentations, and you know, I have been working on Cuba for 60 years, and I don't think I am a fool. And I have written a lot and published a lot about the availability and reliability for statistics in Cuba. The first article was published in 1969. It was so large that it couldn't accommodate in one single issue of Latin American Research Review. So it was published in 2 issues. And later on in life, uh, what is the name of the Spaniard of the historian? Frajinal. Manuel Moreno Frajinal told me that when he was in Cuba, at the time that these articles were published in English, he was in some position in the Ministry of Foreign Trade, and he translated this article to and circulated among Cuban authorities in order for them to become acquainted of the flaws in the Cuban statistics. I swear, I mean, this is one of the moments in my life that I said, my God, I mean, I have some proof that what I write about Cuba have some effects. But I kept revising, new Cuban statistics. I published like 4 or 5 articles in Cuban studies through time, and I just published, or it's coming, I think it's coming, in what is the publication in Bogota? Foro Cubano. They asked me for an article on on that question, reliability of Cuban statistics, and I have an article which is, I think is forthcoming, and still it's not out on this issue. In this article, I present 2 positions, which again are extreme. One that says Cuban statistics are totally unreliable and that we shouldn't do anything about it. The other one is Cuban statistics are 100% reliable and we should trust them. I don't believe it. I think the truth is always somewhere in the middle. If you follow the opinion that these statistics are garbage, and then there has not been any research on Cuba for 60-some years. Let's face it. I mean, you will be using all that. If you look at the literature published on Cuba, I was a student and I saw the transition. The literature that began at the beginning was completely politicized, ideological. There was no data, there were no footnotes, it were opinions. And you remember Theodore Draper? For me, he changed my life because this guy is dead now, I suppose. He was a liberal, and he began to document everything that he said. This is what we have to do. So Theodore Draper was my inspirator on my own work. And we have been building and building. And I mean, another important point, look, I show you an economic disaster in Cuba. You don't have any doubt about it, right? From where comes the data? It comes from Cuba. Now, you could argue, and I won't discuss that the reality is worse. Yeah, but already, I mean, I will be called a counter-revolutionary for an article. I am sure I did publish this article in Spanish first in Cuba on purpose, because I wanted to appear there in internet. And of course, there are a lot of people that tell terrible things about me, but I don't care. I don't care. I mean, that's the point.
Thank you. Read one other question from our virtual colleagues. Natalia Delgado wants to know if you know about the new hotels built with money from, she thinks, the Paris Club and structured to pay that debt.
No, I don't know. Natalia, if you can send me that information, I would appreciate it a lot.
Okay, so we'll come back to the floor. Yes, we'll take a couple of questions here and there.
In the number of hotels, the size of the hotels, the quality and locations of the hotels. And I've been doing commercial real estate in South Florida for over 40 years. So that's why I'm paying a little bit more attention to what I'm seeing. And so before they started working in Pelia, they would do initially there were 25-year leases, then that wasn't enough to reach the cash, they went to 50-year leases. They tried to go to 100, and they would talk about that. That the Spanish would put money in to service the hotel. Now they don't talk about
Excuse me. Who don't talk about
it.
it?
Cuba doesn't talk about it.
Um.
The sources of the funds. So I'm left wondering, where's the money coming from? So I had to, like really just go into fantasy mode. Say, where's it coming from? So let's not count it. But my first reaction was, could the Russians be laundering money in Cuba, building hotels? What a perfect place. You're not going to get returns on that money for a long time. So it's slow money. So I'm asking people, help me out, figure, because it's not one hotel anymore. We went from the renovations to the Kapinski, somebody want to help me out? Well, the hotel's a renovation. The hotel's beautiful, that skyline. Pero the Alton on Mancon that just finished, the 800-room hotel in Primera Avenida and 70th Avenue, 800 rooms. That's a big investment. And Cuba's broke. Cuba can't pay China, can't pay Russia, can't buy food. Where's that money coming from? Nobody's talking about this. Somebody needs to, maybe you should look into it. You could look into it for us.
Yeah, I wish I have an answer, but of course I don't. Now, the Kapinski is a German chain. It's an international chain. The manager, right? The manager. Well, I mean, what you are speculating.
Yes.
It's not only, it could be not only true for Russia, but it could be any other country in the world.
Yes.
So that's a possibility. The problem to do that research is how the hell are you going to find the answer? I mean, that's not an issue because it's a secret thing. The basis of laundering the money, nobody's going to tell you.
No,
So it's a very important question, but I think it will be, I don't want to discourage anybody here that would like to do that. I would love to see something on this, but
I think you might be
it
able
will
to
be
trace it.
very difficult.
You might be able to trace it back to the management companies.
But you think that they are going to reveal from where the money came?
Okay, can we turn to a second question here, please?
Excellent presentation, as always. Let me ask you this one. With that recent death of the head of GAESA, do you see any changes there in view of the closeness that was to the leadership of the country? Please.
So could you repeat the end of the question? With the death of
Since
the,
death of the,
yes, the question?
you see any changes in GAESA
Ah.
going forward? Since I don't know who's the replacement and what connection they have to the top leadership.
Yeah, well, this is again an educated guess, but I don't think there will be any change. Because the important thing, as I said before, is that GAESA is a major factor controlling the Cuban economy. But why they should change it? All of them, you can see these people traveling abroad and, they are rich. Therefore, the organization as such have the control, and whoever is a new head of this, you're going to continue to do what the group wants him or her to do.
They have the same power as the previous.
Well, the power is in the armed forces. That's where the power is. And I think the armed forces we kept, is a combination of oligarchs with the military, which is extremely powerful and dangerous. I don't see that there will be a change there.
Let me raise a couple of questions from our virtual audience. One is from our colleague, Guada Aragon, and she wants to know if you have any figures on the increase of crime in Cuba and the increase of infant mortality.
Okay, I have not done any work on crime, but what I read and what I hear is that petty theft and all the more serious crimes are increasing in Cuba. And actually, I remember having read an article some time ago that there was a correlation between economic crisis and increasing crime. So every time that there is an economic crisis, that was in the 1990s too, crime increases because people are desperate for food, they will do anything. But all the crimes that are like killing and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the infant mortality is a different story. And here is Sergio, who is the top expert on that. But first of all, you have a declining trend in infant mortality in Cuba, and it goes down, and it was for many years the lowest in the Western Hemisphere after Canada, but then begin to increase. And if I remember correctly, the latest figure is like 7.2, right? It was 7.6 and now 7.2. So there is a reverse in the trend. But more important than that, in an article that Sergio and I published, I should say that, and Sergio will agree with me, the most difficult article that we have published in our careers was this article, right, Sergio? It was published in the Journal of Latin American Studies in the United Kingdom. And we have to go through like 7 revisions. Sometimes I was saying, Carlos, let's quit. And he said, no, let's continue. All the time he said it, I said, no, let's continue. And we prevailed. But if you cannot believe how many revisions we have to do. You know, we have been in this business for a long time, and there is no doubt about this, that the readers of this article were sympathetic to the Cuban Revolution, and what they were reading was a documented analysis of the disaster in healthcare. But there we put together 3 academic studies published about the reliability. Here we go again, the reliability of infant mortality. And the conclusion of these scholars, there were like 6 of them altogether, was that the data was underestimated. They even make I can't remember now, but they even make a calculus of how much it should be if it were not this underestimation. So this is concerning infant mortality. And I always had curiosity how you can have 2 different trends in mortality. Infant mortality go down, but maternal mortality going up. And the peak in maternal mortality was in 2020. It was 176.6 per 100,000. Now, Cuba used to have before 38, 40, which was not the best in Latin America, actually. There were several countries, Chile, etc., that had lower, we counted, I think, 6 lower maternal mortality than Cuba. But 176, Cuba went back to the late 1950s. When you look at the series of maternal mortality, that figure is not found, but in the 1950s. The new figure that came out now is, I think, about 40 something. So it went down. So what happened in this year that there were so many women dying in delivery, you know? There is no statistical explanation for something like this. It's an anomaly? I don't know. But I think this is very interesting. Increasing maternal mortality, declining, but maternal mortality gets a peak and goes down, and infant mortality is increasing again.
We'll take another question from our virtual audience and another one from the floor, and then we're going to conclude. Juan Fernandez asked, why do you advocate for Cuba a state market economy a la China instead of a full market economy?
Yeah, believe me that I have struggled with that issue for many years, and And there are people in Crete like Sebastian and Jorge that have asked me something more or less around that point. If you ask me what I would like to have for Cuba, I would say a hybrid economy, a combination of the state, the social welfare state typical of the Scandinavian country, but other countries in Europe as well, in which you have a very strong economy capable of supporting a very wide social net to protect the population. And there are several Cubans that talk about the mixed economy more or less in the same terms. And of course, with democracy. That's what I would like. But look, I mean, I am a very realistic man. I have been working on Cuba for 60-some years. And what are the chances that that could happen in Cuba? I think maybe I am a pessimistic because it's a matter of age. I am 88, and I am going to see this. I am not going to see this. As one more year, less chance I have to see this. So for me, it's more feasible, politically speaking, in Cuba, to have a Sino Vietnamese model than a full market economy. And look, I have been very critical of the Cuban economy for more than half a century. I think it's difficult to find somebody that is more critical than I am, but critical in a documented manner, right? But I feel for the people of Cuba. And if there could be an improvement in the standard of living of Cuba, I will go for that. I know that this is politically questionable, but I won't try to destroy the Cuban regime by famishing the Cuban people. So is this system, I don't have any hopes, because one of the points of the book, of course, is that China, there is a regression. There was some flexibility in previous leaders, but now with the Xi presidency, everything is back. And there is a universal agreement on that. In Vietnam, no, that has not happened so far, at least. But this is a pregnation.
Thank you. So we'll take one final question. Maybe somebody in a second, please. Anyone else? So go ahead.
There are no sanctions against China and Vietnam, right?
You mean sanctions
From the
against
United- from
Cuba?
the no, there are no sanctions against Vietnam and China.
Oh, no,
by the United
China,
States.
China never have a U.S. embargo, but Vietnam have a U.S. embargo for many years. And one of the things that I do in the book is the Chinese agrarian, both in China and in Vietnam, the reforms began in agriculture. And I have been saying this for many years. Also, people like Armando Nova have been saying this. You should start for this. This is the most important problem that you have. And you can, the important thing is that Vietnam did the agrarian reform under the U.S. embargo. So if Vietnam did this under the U.S. embargo, Cuba can do it. And in a few years, less than a decade, the case of China is more dramatic because there were famines. Millions of people would die of hunger. And China is self-sufficient in food. Vietnam is not only self-sufficient in food, he is a major exporter, for instance, on rice. The second largest exporter of rice is Vietnam. So if Vietnam did this, Cuba could do it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
And then one last comment. There's an issue between asset ownership and the management of the asset in the hotel business. So that's what we have to research. In other words, who owns the physical asset and who is managing that asset? So-called management, which might very well include equipment and so on. But the difference is who owns the asset and who manages the asset.
Thank you, Jorge.
Good point.
Thank you all. Yes. You want to-
Yeah, uh, Cuba publishes the data on abortion. It's the highest in Latin America. And when I say that I am intrigued by this difference in trends, is because some of the deaths can result from abortion because it's free and available. But most of the deaths are caused by problems, hygiene, and things like that, which have deteriorated very significant. So, but if that happens with women, why it doesn't happen with babies? You know?
So we have to stop. Our time is up. Thank you all for joining us, both here and virtually. And I wanted to mention that the paper will be available on our website to download, and also there are hard copies here if you haven't gotten one. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oye, me encantó. Porque yo trabajé mucho para resumir. Te hago cuenta que un día entre las pero no puedo mandar el. No, pues está bien, ojalá la gente lo vea. Sí, no, es el proceso de resumir. Oh, qué gusto verte. Así que yo lo el año que viene. Bueno. Aquí sí, el reto es una mierda. Nada de fatal. Nada de fatal, pero muchas cosas.